A cry in the dark. Pastor Jonathan Wheeler's footsteps echoed against the quiet tile floor of Miller's grocery, the aisles lined with familiar brands and colors. The air was stale, yet comforting, as he walked through the near-empty store. His thoughts were wrapped up in the upcoming sermon, a passage from Psalms that he was determined to make relevant to his community's everyday struggles. As he approached the cereal aisle, he found himself absent-mindedly reaching for a box of granola, a brand Mary loved. It had been a long week of tending to the needs of his congregation, visiting the sick, guiding the lost, and offering counsel to those who sought it. Crestview was a small town with its fair share of trials, but it was also a place where people cared for one another. Jonathan had always found peace in this routine. There was a sense of order to life here, and in his role as pastor, he had come to believe that order, whether in a sermon, a prayer, or a comforting touch, was what people needed to feel secure in the chaos of their lives. He placed the box of granola in his cart and glanced over to where Betty, the elderly cashier, was restocking a display of candy. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly above, casting a cold glow over the rows of products. Betty gave him a soft smile, her wrinkled face glowing with a warmth that had come with years of service. It was the kind of smile that only someone who had spent decades in a small town could give, a smile full of trust and familiarity. But just as Jonathan turned to head toward the checkout, a faint sound made him pause. A cry. It was distant, yet piercing in its fragility. A weak, almost imperceptible sound that tugged at his attention. He paused and turned, his hand tightening on the handle of his cart. He looked back toward Betty, but she was busy, oblivious to the sound. He hesitated for a moment, convinced that it must be some child in the aisles crying. But as he listened again, he realized it was different, more like the cry of a baby. Jonathan's heart fluttered, an inexplicable sense of urgency bubbling within him. His eyes scanned the store, then shifted to the parking lot visible through the front windows. The cry was faint, but it was real. Without hesitation, he set the cart aside and walked briskly toward the back of the store. The cold air of the evening wrapped around him as he stepped out into the dimming twilight. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars. The sky was streaked with purple and orange hues from the setting sun, and the air felt crisp against his skin. As Jonathan walked past the rows of parked vehicles, he could hear the cry again, louder this time. It was coming from somewhere behind the store. He moved swiftly, his shoes clicking sharply on the concrete as he made his way to the back loading dock. The area behind Miller's grocery was dark and almost abandoned, save for a few scattered crates and the large green dumpster that loomed in the corner of his vision. The cry pierced the air once more, louder now, and Jonathan's stomach tightened with dread. "Dear God, what is that?" he thought, his pace quickening as he neared the dumpster. There was no mistaking it. The cry was unmistakable, a baby's cry. He stopped just short of the dumpster, his breath catching in his throat as he looked around. The faint sound of rustling came from the pile of bags and boxes that surrounded the dumpster. Jonathan's heart was pounding in his chest now, a mix of fear and concern rising within him. He knew that babies didn't belong here, not in the dark, behind a grocery store, cold and abandoned. He approached cautiously, kneeling down beside the dumpster, his hands trembling as he gripped its rusted edge. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Was this some sort of prank? A sick joke? No, this felt too real, too raw. His pulse quickened as he lifted himself slightly, peering over the side of the dumpster. His eyes scanned the mess of discarded boxes and bags, and then, buried beneath the refuse, he saw it. A bundle. A small, fragile bundle wrapped in a thin, worn blue blanket. The fabric shifted slightly as the baby let out another weak cry, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. His hand instinctively reached toward the bundle, his fingers brushing the rough, discarded fabric. He could feel the warmth of the tiny body beneath the cloth. Without thinking, he hoisted himself up and over the side of the dumpster, reaching in to carefully gather the child into his arms. The baby was lighter than he had expected, but the warmth of its skin against his hands filled him with a strange sense of urgency. The child, no older than 3 months, was completely vulnerable. His heart pounded harder in his chest as he cradled the tiny form. The baby's skin was dark, his eyes barely open as he whimpered weakly. Jonathan's mind raced, and for a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. How could anyone leave such a precious life in a place like this? "Dear Lord," Jonathan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The baby's tiny fists waved in the air, grasping at nothing, and Jonathan quickly held him closer, the desperation in his heart growing. He stood up, his legs feeling weak as he adjusted his hold on the child. He looked around, as if expecting someone to step forward and explain why this had happened. But there was no one. The parking lot was empty, save for a few vehicles. The sound of his breath was the only noise in the cold air, and he felt an overwhelming sense of isolation as he stood there, cradling the child in his arms. Jonathan moved quickly toward the store's back door, calling over his shoulder to Betty, who was still restocking the candy aisle, unaware of the life-changing moment taking place outside. "Betty, call the authorities," he called, his voice urgent. "There's a baby out here. Someone needs to help." The elderly cashier glanced up briefly, nodding, but didn't seem to fully comprehend what Jonathan was saying. He didn't care. He could deal with that later. What mattered now was the baby, the fragile, abandoned soul that had been left to fend for itself in the harsh, cold night. As he made his way through the back door, Jonathan's thoughts raced. What had happened? How could anyone abandon a child like this? The baby squirmed in his arms, and he instinctively adjusted his hold, trying to soothe it with soft murmurs. He had to keep it safe. He had to do something. He carried the child into his office at Crestview Church, the warmth of the building wrapping around him as he gently laid the baby down on a small cot in the corner. Jonathan's mind was spinning with questions. Who was this child? Where had he come from? But one thing was certain. The child needed him. He couldn't abandon him now. Not when he had already made the decision to act. Jonathan stood over the baby, his heart filled with a mix of tenderness and fear. There was so much he didn't know about this child, but one thing was clear. This baby was his responsibility now. And as the baby let out another weak cry, Jonathan vowed that he would protect it with everything he had. The journey ahead would be one of unknowns, filled with challenges and questions he could not yet answer. But for now, he would give this baby something that had been denied to him: love and safety. "Don't worry," Jonathan whispered, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "You're safe now." He would never have imagined that his life, and the life of this baby, was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly fathom. The truth about this child's past, and the secrets buried deep within it, would soon come crashing down. But for now, he had only one focus: keeping this child safe, and he would, no matter what. The decision to raise a stranger. The following days after Jonathan Wheeler's discovery of the abandoned baby were a whirlwind of activity. But amid the chaos, one thing remained certain: he would not let this child slip through his grasp. He could hardly believe what had unfolded, the sudden, inexplicable appearance of a life that needed him. But in his heart, the decision had already been made. This baby, abandoned in the cold, must have been sent into his arms for a reason. Jonathan stayed up late the night of the discovery, sitting at his desk, his gaze flicking from the baby lying in the crib to the Bible open before him. The pages of scripture seemed to flicker in the dim light, but the words barely registered in his mind. His thoughts were preoccupied with the child, the tiny life that had come to him in such an unthinkable way. Isaac. The name had come to him in a quiet whisper as he stood over the child that night, cradling him close. It seemed fitting. Isaac, meaning laughter, was a name that represented a new beginning. Jonathan could feel in his bones that this child, this innocent soul, would bring something precious into his life. He didn't know how or in what ways, but he knew the child had a purpose. After a restless night, Jonathan woke to the sound of morning light pouring through the windows of the parsonage, casting golden rays across the worn wooden floor. He moved through the house, making the necessary arrangements, though the day still felt strange and uncertain. The baby, Isaac, as Jonathan had named him, was awake when Jonathan entered the room, his eyes blinking in the soft light, a faint coo escaping his lips. There was something undeniably vulnerable in those eyes, something that reached deep into Jonathan's soul. It was a look of abandonment, of uncertainty, but also of trust. Mary, Jonathan's wife, stood in the doorway, observing the baby with an unreadable expression. Mary had always been the more pragmatic of the two. Her love for children was boundless, but her realistic nature often balanced Jonathan's more idealistic tendencies. She knew that raising a child was no small feat, and this wasn't just any child. It was a child found in a dumpster, with no clear origins or support system. Mary's heart was kind, but her mind raced with questions he couldn't yet answer. "What are we going to do, Jonathan?" she asked, her voice low, tinged with concern. "We don't know anything about him. His family, his past. There's so much we don't understand." Jonathan took a deep breath, looking down at Isaac, who had begun to reach for his finger, his tiny hand clutching it as though trying to ground himself in the world. "I know, Mary," Jonathan replied softly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "But this child was brought to us for a reason. He needs a family, and we have a responsibility to give him the love and care he deserves." Mary's brow furrowed slightly as she watched Jonathan, her eyes searching his face for some sign of doubt or uncertainty. She knew him well enough to see when he was driven by something deeper than logic. And right now, he was speaking from a place of purpose, something that Mary couldn't ignore, even if she wasn't entirely sure she understood. "I'm not saying it's wrong to take him in," Mary said, her voice steady but softening. "But we have to think about everything. What does it mean for our family? For the church? What will people say?" Jonathan walked toward her, gently lifting Isaac from his crib and cradling him in his arms, his gaze never leaving the child. Isaac's dark eyes locked onto Jonathan's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. It was as though the child had already claimed him, as though Jonathan had no choice in the matter. "I know it won't be easy," Jonathan said, his voice calm but resolute. "But this child deserves a chance. No one should grow up abandoned like this. I don't care about what people think. What matters is that we give him what he needs: love, safety, and a place to call home." Mary's expression softened, and she walked over, placing a gentle hand on Isaac's tiny back. She could feel the warmth of the child's body against her palm. She had always wanted children of her own, but Jonathan had been content in their quiet life, just the two of them. Now things were changing in ways she hadn't expected. "I suppose there's no turning back now, is there?" Mary said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Jonathan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the child. "No, there isn't. We can't turn back, but we can move forward together." And so, that was how Isaac came into their lives. There was no grand ceremony, no paperwork or formal adoption proceedings. Just two people who decided, in the silence of their hearts, that they would open their home and their lives to a child in need. A child who had no family, no history, and no future, except for the one they would create for him. As the weeks passed, Isaac became a part of their family in ways they hadn't anticipated. Mary, despite her initial doubts, found herself growing fond of the boy. He was quiet and observant, but he had a light in his eyes that seemed to sparkle with curiosity. Isaac's laughter, though rare at first, soon became a staple in the Wheeler household, a reminder of the joy that a child brought to the world. Even the church, where Jonathan worked as the local pastor, began to embrace Isaac as one of their own. Yet, despite the growing bond between them, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Isaac's story than he could understand. His past was a mystery, and the questions gnawed at him. even when he smiled at Isaac's innocent face. How had Isaac ended up in that dumpster? Who had abandoned him? And why? One night, as Jonathan sat alone in his office, reviewing the sermon he was preparing for the following Sunday, his thoughts drifted back to the baby. Isaac was asleep in the next room, but Jonathan's mind refused to quiet. The nagging questions kept coming back. Could Isaac have been the result of a mistake, a child unwanted by his parents, or was there something more sinister lurking in the background? There were far too many unanswered questions, and Jonathan wasn't sure he was ready to face them. But deep down, he knew that one day, those questions would demand answers. Mary entered the office quietly, her steps soft as she moved toward Jonathan. She paused for a moment before speaking, sensing his unease. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but knowing. Jonathan looked up at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "I can't help it, Mary. There's so much we don't know about him. I can't stop wondering where he came from, who he really is." Mary sat down beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "I know, Jonathan, but maybe we're not supposed to know everything right now. Maybe we're just meant to love him and give him the life he deserves. That's what matters." Jonathan let out a long, weary sigh. She was right, of course. They didn't have all the answers. They never would. But what they did have was enough for now. Love, a safe home, and each other. As Jonathan sat back in his chair, staring at the empty pages of his sermon notes, he realized that the future wasn't about uncovering Isaac's past. It was about shaping the future that they would have together, one step at a time. Isaac had been entrusted to them, and it was up to Jonathan and Mary to create a future filled with love, hope, and belonging. For now, that was all that mattered. The unspoken truth. The months that followed Isaac's arrival into the Wheeler family were full of moments both tender and difficult. He had quickly become a central part of their home, his laughter and cries filling the spaces that had once been eerily quiet. Jonathan and Mary had grown to love him deeply, their bond with him becoming as natural as breathing. But even as Isaac grew, the questions about his origins continued to haunt Jonathan. Each passing day, he tried to push the concerns to the back of his mind, telling himself that love was enough. But deep down, he knew the truth. Isaac's past was a shadow that couldn't be ignored forever. Isaac was now 4 years old, and his presence in the Wheeler household had become a familiar comfort. His dark, soulful eyes, so much like the deep brown of Jonathan's own, shone with curiosity and wonder. He had taken to the small life they had built, and in many ways, Isaac seemed like any other child. He had his favorite toys, his preferred bedtime stories, and his own rituals, like how he always insisted that Jonathan pray with him before bed, his tiny hands clasped in a form of innocence that made Jonathan's heart ache. There was still something special about Isaac, though. Jonathan could see it in the way the child reacted to certain things. Isaac was particularly sensitive to loud noises, often covering his ears when a car honked or a thunderstorm rumbled. And there were moments when he would go quiet, his expression distant as if lost in some thought or memory that Jonathan could not reach. Mary noticed it too. "He's just a bit shy," she would say when Jonathan expressed his concern. But Jonathan couldn't help but wonder. It was as though Isaac was holding something back, something deep within himself that he wasn't ready to share. It wasn't long before the inevitable moment came. One rainy afternoon, as the sun barely peeked through the clouds, a visitor arrived at the Wheeler parsonage. Jonathan was at his desk, his mind focused on the upcoming sermon, while Mary was in the kitchen preparing lunch for Isaac and herself. The doorbell rang, an unexpected sound that broke through the peaceful hum of the day. When Jonathan opened the door, he was met by a man in a well-tailored suit, his face stern, his eyes obscured by dark sunglasses. The stranger didn't introduce himself immediately, instead glancing past Jonathan, his gaze settling on the small boy playing in the yard. "I'm looking for a child," the man said, his voice low and formal. "A child that was abandoned near Miller's grocery about 4 years ago." Jonathan's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat as the world seemed to shift under him. The man's words, though spoken calmly, carried the weight of a truth Jonathan had tried so hard to avoid. "What? What are you talking about?" Jonathan asked, his voice tight. He tried to remain calm, but the sudden tension in the air was palpable. "Who are you, and why are you asking about a child who was abandoned?" The man's lips tightened into a thin line as he took a step forward. "I have information about the boy you've taken in," he said, the words like a dagger to Jonathan's heart. "I need to speak to you about him. It's urgent." The cold realization struck Jonathan like a ton of bricks. This man wasn't just any passerby. He knew something about Isaac, something he hadn't known himself. Jonathan's heart raced, and for a split second, he considered slamming the door in the man's face. But something in the stranger's demeanor, an authority that was almost palpable, kept him from doing so. Instead, Jonathan stepped back, motioning for the man to come inside. "Fine," Jonathan said, his voice low and tense. "But you're going to explain yourself. Now." The man entered the house, his eyes never leaving Jonathan. Mary, still in the kitchen, had heard the conversation and emerged cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the stranger's serious demeanor. She didn't speak, but Jonathan could see the concern etched across her face. "I'm Agent Michael Stone," the man said, offering a brief nod to Mary before continuing. "I work with a government agency that specializes in cases like this. We've been searching for the boy for years, and I'm afraid I have some information that you need to hear." Jonathan's pulse quickened, and he could feel the blood drain from his face. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in on him as the weight of the moment sank in. "What do you mean cases like this?" Jonathan asked, his voice tight. "What is it you're not telling me? Who is Isaac?" Agent Stone didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, his hands folded behind his back as he seemed to choose his words carefully. The silence stretched between them, and Jonathan's impatience grew, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "Your son," Agent Stone finally said, turning back toward Jonathan, "is not just any child. He was never meant to be abandoned. Isaac, he was a part of something much bigger, something beyond what you could ever imagine." Jonathan's stomach lurched, his grip tightening on the arm of the chair. "What are you talking about?" he asked, almost in a whisper, as if the words themselves would break the fragile reality he had created for himself and Mary. Stone sighed, his eyes softening just slightly as he looked at Isaac, who had now come inside the house, playing innocently with his toys. "Isaac is not the child you think he is," the agent said. "He has a very special origin. You see, Isaac is not simply an abandoned child. He was part of an experiment, a very classified, top-secret project. His biological parents were involved in a program that—" "No," Jonathan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not hearing this. Isaac is my son. I don't care where he came from. I've raised him as my own, and I won't let you take him from me." Agent Stone's expression didn't change, but there was a hardness to his gaze now. "I'm not here to take him, Jonathan," he said gently. "But you need to understand that his past is complicated. The people who left him behind had their reasons. And those reasons, they go beyond anything you could imagine." Jonathan's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, though they still didn't fit. A government agency, a secret project, Isaac being a part of something larger, something darker. But there was one thing Jonathan was certain of, above all else. Isaac was his son, in every way that mattered. No amount of secrets or hidden pasts would change that. "Agent Stone," Jonathan said firmly, "I don't care about your project, your agency, or any of the secrets you're holding. Isaac is my son. No matter who he was before, he is mine now. And that's all that matters." Stone looked at him for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Finally, he nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "I understand your attachment, Jonathan. But you need to know the truth. Isaac's story doesn't end with you. There's a bigger picture here, and one day he will have to face it. Jonathan shook his head, the weight of the agent's words pressing on his chest. I don't care what comes next. Isaac is my responsibility now, and nothing you say is going to change that. With a long pause, Agent Stone finally turned toward the door. We'll be in touch, he said quietly, before disappearing into the rain. As the door clicked shut, Jonathan stood frozen, his heart pounding, and the lingering question in his mind grew even louder. What was Isaac's past really about, and what would it mean for the future? But no matter what came next, Jonathan knew one thing for sure. Isaac was his son, and nothing at all, could ever change that. The burden of truth. The rain outside had turned into a steady downpour, its rhythmic tapping against the windows echoing in the silence of the house. Jonathan stood at the door, still processing Agent Stone's words, the truth of what he had heard settling like a heavy weight on his chest. Isaac's past, his true identity, was a mystery, one that Jonathan wasn't sure he was ready to unravel. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the questions only grew louder. Isaac, the child he had raised with all his heart, was a product of something much larger than he had ever imagined. A secret project, a program that Jonathan couldn't even begin to comprehend. These were things that now lingered in the shadows of their home. He had spent the last 4 years convincing himself that the boy in his care was just a normal child, an innocent soul who had been abandoned by cruel circumstances. But now it felt as though that image was slipping away, replaced by something far more complicated and dangerous. Jonathan's mind kept returning to one question. Why? Why had Isaac been left behind, and what did this government project entail? Why hadn't anyone come for him sooner? Why had the people who were supposed to care for him disappeared without a trace? As the night stretched on, Jonathan found himself pacing in the living room, unable to sit still. He glanced over at Isaac, who was sitting on the floor, drawing with crayons, blissfully unaware of the storm that had begun to brew in his father's mind. Isaac's innocence, his untainted joy, was a stark contrast to the troubling thoughts that consumed Jonathan. How could he protect Isaac from a past that was so elusive, so filled with shadows? And how could he reconcile the love he felt for the boy with the unsettling knowledge that Isaac's origins were tied to something far beyond his control? Mary had remained quiet since Agent Stone left, her thoughts likely as troubled as Jonathan's. She hadn't spoken much after the agent's visit, but Jonathan knew she was processing everything just as he was. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the silence any longer, Jonathan turned to Mary, who was sitting by the fireplace, her face cast in the soft glow of the flames. Mary, he began, his voice low but thick with emotion. What are we supposed to do? I don't know how to make sense of all this. Isaac is our son, but his past is something we can't ignore. I can't just pretend everything is the same. I have to know the truth. Mary didn't respond immediately. She let the question hang in the air for a long moment, her gaze shifting from the fire to Jonathan, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. I don't know what the truth is, Jonathan, she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in the air. But I do know that Isaac is ours, no matter what. We've raised him. We've loved him. And that hasn't changed. I know you're afraid, but we can't let fear of the unknown tear us apart. We have to face it together. Jonathan nodded, though he didn't feel any more certain. He understood her words, but the weight of the situation seemed insurmountable. The more he thought about Isaac's origins, the more he realized that the boy's life, his future, might not be entirely in his hands. There were forces at play here that Jonathan couldn't control, no matter how hard he tried. The thought of Isaac being a part of something dangerous, something secret, twisted his insides. I just want him to be safe, Mary, Jonathan said quietly. I want him to have the life he deserves. But what if his past catches up to him? What if these people, these agents, come for him? What if we're not enough to protect him? Mary reached out, placing a hand on Jonathan's, her touch grounding him in the midst of his spiraling thoughts. "Jonathan," she said firmly, her voice unwavering, "we are enough. We've given Isaac love, safety, and a future. No one can take that away from us. We're his family now. And no matter what comes, we'll face it together." Jonathan squeezed her hand, taking comfort in her words, but the worry still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the threat of outside forces, it was the fear of Isaac's own destiny. The fear that Isaac might have inherited something darker than Jonathan had ever anticipated. The following days were filled with an uneasy tension that lingered over the house. Jonathan continued to preach at the church, his sermons becoming more reflective, more filled with questions about fate, purpose, and the mysteries of the human heart. He poured his energy into his work, but his mind always returned to Isaac. What kind of future awaited the boy who had been abandoned in a dumpster? Could he ever escape the legacy of his origins? And would Isaac ever truly be able to live the life that Jonathan had imagined for him? Mary, too, was wrestling with her own emotions. She had always been the steady one, the voice of reason when Jonathan's heart led him into uncertainty. But even she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that Isaac's past, his true identity, was something they would eventually have to confront. There were too many unanswered questions, too many risks they couldn't yet understand. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Isaac came to Jonathan with a simple question that shook him to his core. "Dad," Isaac asked, his voice soft, his eyes wide with curiosity, "where did I come from?" The question hit Jonathan like a blow to the chest. He had avoided thinking about this moment, had hoped it would never come. But here Isaac was, his innocent face looking up at him, asking a question that Jonathan didn't know how to answer. Jonathan's heart raced, and he found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain to Isaac that his origins were shrouded in mystery, tied to a secret government project that had never been meant to reach him? How could he tell Isaac that the world he had come to know, the world of safety, love, and belonging, might be shattered by the truth? But Isaac didn't seem frightened by the question he had posed. His small hands clutched his stuffed animal tightly as he waited for an answer, his trust in Jonathan absolute. Jonathan took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "You came from a place of love, Isaac," he said gently, choosing his words carefully. "You were meant to be loved, and we found you. You're ours, and that's all that matters. You don't need to worry about where you came from, because you're here now, and that's what's important." Isaac's face lit up with a smile, his small hands reaching up to hug Jonathan. For a moment, Jonathan felt the weight of the world lift, the love he had for the boy shining through the darkness of his own uncertainty. But in his heart, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. The questions would keep coming, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't protect Isaac from the truth forever. One day, the past would catch up with them. Unraveling the past. The days that followed Isaac's innocent question seemed to blur together in a haze of worry and confusion. Jonathan's mind never fully escaped the tension that had settled over their household, the weight of secrets and unanswered questions looming like a shadow that refused to dissipate. He could see the subtle changes in Isaac, the little pauses during moments of laughter, the quiet staring into space that often followed certain situations. Isaac, though still a child in many ways, was beginning to understand that something wasn't right. As much as Jonathan tried to shield him from it, Isaac had started to pick up on the fear and uncertainty that had seeped into the house. Mary had been doing her best to keep things as normal as possible, but even she couldn't hide the growing sense of unease. The questions remained unanswered, festering just beneath the surface, and Jonathan knew deep down that he couldn't keep running from the truth forever. The arrival of another stranger only intensified Jonathan's unease. It happened late one evening, as he was preparing to tuck Isaac into bed. There was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent, its urgency sending a chill down Jonathan's spine. He looked at Mary, who stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her eyes wide with concern. "I'll get it," Jonathan said quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy, each one seemingly echoing in the stillness of the house. When he opened it, he was met by a woman in her mid-30s, her expression tense but not unfriendly. She was dressed in business attire, expensive, tailored clothing that didn't quite match the calm of the suburban neighborhood. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and for a moment, Jonathan felt the weight of her gaze as though she were trying to read his soul. "Pastor Wheeler?" the woman asked, her voice smooth and authoritative. "Yes," Jonathan replied, his voice cautious. He instinctively stepped back from the door, as if trying to shield the warmth of the house from the cold air the stranger had brought with her. "My name is Emily Wright," the woman introduced herself. "I'm with a private investigative firm. I need to speak with you about Isaac." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. Isaac's name seemed to echo in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken meaning. His hands clenched into fists, a protective instinct rising within him. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing Mary standing just inside, her expression unreadable but filled with concern. "We don't need any investigators," Jonathan said, his voice firm, though the uncertainty was still there, tugging at his resolve. "Isaac is our son. We've raised him, and that's all that matters." Emily's expression softened, but only slightly. "I understand," she said, her tone gentle now, though still carrying an air of authority. "But you need to know that Isaac's story is more complicated than that. There's a reason he was abandoned, and there's a reason no one came for him." Jonathan felt a sharp pang in his chest, the words like ice slipping down his spine. He had suspected there was more to Isaac's story, but hearing it confirmed by a stranger, someone who clearly knew things he didn't, struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I don't know what you think you know," Jonathan said, forcing himself to stand tall, "but Isaac is my son. He's been with us for 4 years. We've given him a home, a family. He's ours." Emily gave him a measured look, her eyes never leaving his. "I understand your attachment," she said, her voice softening. "But you need to hear the whole story. Isaac is not just any child, and the truth about his origins is something that will affect all of you." Jonathan's mind raced, the weight of her words pressing on him. He couldn't protect Isaac from the truth forever. The reality of what Isaac was, what he had been a part of, was seeping into every corner of their lives, and Jonathan knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up with them. But he wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to let go of the world he had built for Isaac, the world where love was enough to shield them from the darkness. "Why now?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and tense. "Why come here, to us, after all this time?" Emily paused for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the window, as though making sure no one else was watching. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because the people who were involved in Isaac's creation are looking for him. They've been looking for years, and now they've finally found him." Jonathan's stomach churned, his hands trembling at his sides. This wasn't just some vague threat. These were the people who had abandoned Isaac, the ones who had left him in that dumpster 4 years ago. And now, they were coming for him. "You don't know the whole story, Pastor Wheeler," Emily continued, her voice urgent. "Isaac's parents weren't who you think they were. They were involved in a project that was meant to change the world. They used children like Isaac in a covert program designed to create something more. He's not just an ordinary child, Jonathan. Isaac is a product of genetic engineering, of selective breeding, of a larger experiment that—" "Stop," Jonathan said, his voice breaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "This is insane. My son is not some experiment. He's just a child, a boy who was abandoned by people who didn't care. He deserves love, not to be dragged into some conspiracy." Emily's eyes were unwavering, her tone calm but firm. "I'm not here to hurt him, Jonathan. I'm here to help. But you need to understand that Isaac's future is tied to this project, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. His past is something that will catch up with him, And if you don't take the necessary steps now, you'll be putting him in even more danger." Jonathan stood frozen, the weight of her words suffocating him. He had hoped, desperately hoped, that he could keep Isaac safe, that his love for the boy would be enough to shield him from the horrors of his past. But now, that illusion was shattered. Isaac was caught in the middle of something much larger than either of them could control. "Where do we go from here?" Jonathan finally asked, his voice strained. Emily didn't hesitate. "You need to leave. Now. You need to take Isaac, and you need to go somewhere no one can find you. If you stay here, they will come for him. And when they do, it won't just be them showing up at your door. It'll be much worse than that. You won't be able to protect him, not unless you take him away from all of this." The word struck Jonathan like a blow. He looked over at Isaac, who was now standing at the top of the stairs, watching them curiously, as if he could sense the shift in the air. Jonathan's heart tightened at the thought of telling the boy, at the thought of shattering his innocence with the truth. But there was no choice now. The storm was coming, and Jonathan knew they had to act fast. Isaac's past was no longer something that could be ignored or hidden away. It was time to face it. A new beginning. The days that followed Emily Wright's visit were a blur of frantic preparation and overwhelming fear. Jonathan had always believed that faith could move mountains, that the power of love and community could conquer any obstacle. But as he packed the few belongings they could take with them, along with the few items Isaac held dear, he couldn't help but feel the weight of uncertainty pressing against him, suffocating the hope he once held so tightly. Isaac had been quiet in the days following their conversation. It was as though he knew something was wrong but couldn't quite grasp what it was. He asked few questions, content to stay close to Jonathan and Mary, sensing the tension in the air but unable to understand its source. Jonathan tried his best to reassure the boy, but deep down, he felt the crushing realization that this was no longer just about protecting Isaac from external threats. The real battle now was one of identity, of accepting the truth, however dark it might be, and finding a way to protect Isaac from the consequences of a past neither of them had chosen. In the dead of night, Jonathan and Mary made their move. Isaac, tucked into his blanket, barely stirred as they carried him from the house, under the cover of darkness. There were no goodbyes. There were no assurances that they'd ever return. This was not a vacation or a temporary retreat. It was an escape, a flight from an inevitable truth that was too dangerous to face head-on. Jonathan had packed their car with the barest essentials: clothing, food, Isaac's stuffed bear, and some documents, all hidden away in the trunk. They had no clear destination, only a vague sense that they needed to put as much distance between themselves and the people who were searching for Isaac. Emily's warning echoed in Jonathan's mind. If you stay here, they will come for him. And when they do, it won't just be them showing up at your door. It'll be much worse than that. The weight of her words was unbearable, but Jonathan knew there was no turning back. The road stretched out before them like a never-ending ribbon of uncertainty. As they drove, Jonathan tried to calm his thoughts, but they kept returning to the one question that had been plaguing him since Emily's visit. What would Isaac's future look like if the people behind this project ever found him? What was it that they wanted from him? Mary sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her face set in a grim mask. She hadn't spoken much since they left, but Jonathan could feel her presence, her silent strength, as though it was all that kept him from breaking down. Isaac was asleep in the backseat, blissfully unaware of the danger that hung over them. Jonathan glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his heart breaking at the thought of the boy's innocence being shattered by a truth that didn't belong to him. They drove for hours, the headlights cutting through the pitch-black night. No destination, no plan, just the hope that they would be able to outrun the darkness that had been closing in on them for far too long. By morning, they had crossed into a neighboring state. Jonathan had found a small, secluded town along the highway, a quiet place where no one would ask questions. It was a far cry from the life they had left behind, but for now, it would have to do. As Jonathan pulled into the parking lot of a modest inn, he could feel the weight of the journey beginning to take its toll. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, someone would find them. Someone would discover who Isaac truly was, and the world they had worked so hard to build would come crumbling down around them. Isaac stirred in the backseat, rubbing his eyes as he woke. "Are we there yet, Dad?" he asked, his voice groggy but full of curiosity. Jonathan smiled softly in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, buddy, we're here. Just a little place to rest for the night." Isaac's face lit up, and for a brief moment, Jonathan could see the boy he had raised, the boy who had stolen his heart from the very first moment he held him. But Jonathan knew that the world Isaac had grown up in, the world of safety and love, was a fragile illusion. The truth about his origins would eventually catch up with them. And when it did, Jonathan wasn't sure what would be left standing. They checked into a modest room at the inn, one of those places that catered to weary travelers. It wasn't much, but it was a sanctuary for now, a place to regroup, to breathe. The room was small but clean, with 2 beds, a table, and a window that overlooked a quiet street. As Isaac ran to the window, pressing his face against the glass, Jonathan couldn't help but notice how much the boy had changed in the few short years he had been with them. Isaac had grown taller, his face more defined, his features becoming sharper, more mature with each passing day. But his eyes, the way he looked at the world, had stayed the same. Isaac was still that curious, wide-eyed boy who had never known the meaning of fear. Jonathan sat on the bed, rubbing his face in frustration. The burden of the past, of everything he couldn't control, weighed heavily on him. He wished he could fix everything for Isaac, that he could erase the darkness from his past and give him the future he deserved. But the truth was that no matter how much love and care they poured into Isaac's life, the boy's origins were beyond their control. His future was tied to forces they couldn't even begin to understand. "I don't know how much longer we can run, Jonathan," Mary said quietly from across the room, her voice breaking the silence. "They'll find us. They'll find Isaac, and when they do..." Jonathan's heart sank at the thought. He couldn't bear to think about what would happen if they were found. He had always believed that they could make a difference, that their love for Isaac would be enough to overcome whatever secrets the world threw at them. But now, faced with the reality of what Isaac truly was, Jonathan felt more powerless than ever. "We have to keep him safe, Mary," Jonathan replied, his voice heavy with resolve. "We have to keep running, keep hiding, whatever it takes. I won't let them take him. I won't let them turn him into something he's not." Mary nodded, though the doubt in her eyes was impossible to ignore. They both knew the truth. Isaac's past wasn't something they could outrun forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face it. And when they did, Jonathan wasn't sure how they would survive the consequences. Later that evening, as Jonathan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts turned to the people who had been part of Isaac's past, his biological parents, the ones who had been involved in the experiment. He wondered how they were connected to the government project Emily had mentioned. Were they still alive? Were they searching for Isaac too? Jonathan's eyes flickered toward Isaac, who had fallen asleep on the bed beside him, his face peaceful in slumber. He didn't know how much longer they could keep up this charade, this lie. Isaac deserved the truth, but Jonathan wasn't sure if he was ready to face it himself, let alone share it with the boy. The storm was far from over, and the truth would come out, whether Jonathan was ready or not.